Welcome to this video about pilot incapacitation events. What happens if the pilot is the only one on board? So there is no passenger to help fly the airplane. For the record, I'm filming this on January 5th of 2021. So I want to talk about two basic kinds of situations. For one of them, I'd like to use November 18 Lima, which was the 2006 Baron turbocharged 56TC crash in West Virginia. This was a hypoxia event. Very quickly, let's go to the NTSB final report for this incident. And the reason I've picked this one out of the others like it is because, frankly, I was working the fighter jets that were trailing this airplane when the fuel ran out on one of the engines and the airplane began its fatal spin from approximately flight level 270. It says, while on the last leg of a multi-day cross-country trip back in 2006, and the pilot had been intending to land in the Minneapolis area, he just kept on flying, so NORAD scrambled some fighter jets. I'm not going to get too much into the details here. Basically, he became hypoxic. This was a non-pressurized but oxygen-equipped airplane. Nonetheless, the pilot became hypoxic. There was nothing ATC can do. That's not the point of this. At some level, what happens was that the pilot became incapacitated. NORAD scrambled fighter jets. Later, they swapped him out for a couple of different ones and so on. And eventually, the airplane descended and impacted terrain and so on. If you go through the details here about what actually happened at that point, it will be down here. Starting at 21:46, two more fighter aircraft were scrambled by NORAD to relieve the original intercepting flight, which was running low on fuel. The replacement fighters began tracking the airplane at 22:04 and also attempted to gain the pilot's attention by firing flares. These pilots also noticed in the darkness that the airplane's interior lights were on but could not see the pilot or discern any movement. And at about 22:34, the airplane began to descend. And that's forever seared in my memory from about 15 years ago when the Chevy flight said that the airplane had departed controlled flight and they were requesting a block altitude 10,000 through flight level 280, which unfortunately was a transmission and a request that we knew was coming. The pilot was killed. He'd probably been dead for some time, though I'm not going to focus on that. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about those rare situations where the pilot is having some kind of event, can be a heart attack or something like that, and yet is in that kind of curious gray area position where they're not really quite able to fly the airplane, but maybe they can call us. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult situation. What, if anything, we can do? To discuss that briefly, I want to look at the incident that took place just about a year and a half ago in South Dakota of a Piper Cherokee, November 751901. I want to start by looking at the NTSB's final report for this one. It says that about 15 minutes after departing on a cross-country flight in day VMC, pilot contacted air traffic control to report that he was having chest pains and blacking out and was having difficulty controlling the airplane. I'll show you the ATC transcript in a moment, but basically the controllers hadn't been talking to this guy at all. All of a sudden, he comes on frequency with this incredible problem, and the controllers, to my mind, did a wonderful job. I've got a couple minor quibbles with what they did, but basically did a wonderful job in trying to help the pilot to the extent that they could. I wouldn't be here if I'm not arguing that we can't up the game a little bit. But basically, they did a wonderful job. Ultimately, the airplane did go down in a field in a fairly controlled landing. There was some bad luck probably in the landing, and the pilot was killed and so on. But they did talk to him for about 20 minutes before radio contact was lost. And like I said, the wreckage was located in a field. If you go through the ATC transcript, I'm not going to go through this in real detail here, but basically, he calls out of the clear blue, says, I got hit by this ungodly chest pain. I've never felt anything like it. It feels horribly bad, and so on. Among other things, he says, I do not, I'm going to stay away from houses and things like that. I don't want to be anywhere near houses, stuff like that. And very soon the controller recommends landing like on a road or a field. I will talk about that in a minute. Minor quibble, I do not like roads in most cases. This isn't the place to take this up. And at the moment, I'm actually going to kind of stop talking about 751901 here. And I'll note that I've already previously discussed this briefly in a case study video that I've already recorded called the Learning Lessons from John and Martha King's Case Study Video. I want to take you to just a very small portion of that. Earlier. The pilot was the only person on board. He was killed. So I'm not going to go through the details. You're welcome to go to it. I go through the ATC transcript and that whole thought process, so I'm not going to repeat it here. Ultimately, what happened was the pilot ended up landing in a field. Not totally sure how controlled it was, although, and I'll just go to this part of the video for a second while leaving it paused at about the roughly 32-minute mark. The pilot actually touched down roughly here and had the bad luck to hit a drainage ditch during the ground roll, and that sudden stop, although the airplane kind of bounced through the ditch and ended up about here. That's actually what probably killed him. If he hadn't had that bad luck to hit the drainage ditch, I cannot guarantee that his life would have been saved. But in principle, if you were to go through this, what they controllers did was, because he didn't want to go anywhere near a populated area, in essence what they tried to get him to do was make a controlled off airport landing as soon as possible. And the reason I like it, even though I have a quibble about them suggesting a road, is because in an emergency you're often looking for what's least bad. And while this guy had some bad luck as in terms of that drainage ditch, ultimately making an off-airport landing quickly is maybe what is least bad. So let's go back to the PowerPoint for a second. First of all, something they did not do, and this is outside the box thinking, but it's just something they didn't think of, and I'd like to kind of put it forward here, is in some of these cases maybe we can have the pilot call 911 directly. I actually don't want pilots to get into a long discussion with 911 in these cases. 911 isn't going to fix the heart attack or whatever it is over the phone. This is more about just getting them on the line so that 911 has some sense of what's going on. They might get some location service information, and they can get to whatever field the pilot ends up landing in fairly quickly and so on. But it is something to think about. What I want to do, though, is try to see if we can improve what I'm kind of calling the intentional rural crash. And there's sort of two flavors of it. One is what I'm calling the non-autopilot intentional rural crash. And what I mean by that is this. We have somebody, by the way, if we can get them to an airport and get them on the runway quickly, that's fine. That's preferable. We can get the ambulances to them pretty quick and so on, right? But in some cases we can't for one reason or another. And so that's so easy, I'm actually not going to discuss it if that's even an option. If it's not an option for whatever reason, then we're looking at this intentional rural crash. This slide's going to talk about the non-autopilot version of it. The next slide will talk about the autopilot version. The short version is this, and this needs a bit more work, so I'm just going to leave this in kind of this unpolished form. If you're going to do this intentional rural crash and either not use an autopilot or there's no autopilot on board, basically you want to make the landing with the engine shut off, and that's going to reduce the risk of fire and so on. Now the question of when the engine should get shut off, you can either do it kind of early and then just kind of glide to a landing from altitude. You might set up for a decently long field. Length is an important factor here, but set up to where you're on short final for some off-airport landing, and then shut the engine off prior to the actual touchdown. And again, each situation will be unique, but even if a pilot is having that crushing, chest pain like this pilot in South Dakota was having, it is possible that we can talk them through this and help them convince them to land in a long, suitable field, preferably near a road, A, for access, B, to increase the odds that somebody sees them actually go down. But basically, turn the engine off on final, have the airplane trimmed for the appropriate speed, probably have the flaps down, little question mark about whether we do that. If it's a retractable gear airplane, for many fields, it might actually be better to land with the gear up. That's going to be a little tricky and probably up to the pilot. When the engine gets shut off, whether it's early or on short final, prior to landing, the fuel and the electric should be shut off, including the master switch. The seat belt should be tight, and if appropriate for the airplane, the doors should be unlatched. But the basic version here is get it set up to where the airplane is configured, trimmed. You get the engine, the fuel, the electrics all shut off prior to touchdown with the seat belts tight and the doors potentially unlatched. And that's not bad. Now we've got them on the ground before the heart attack progresses to the point where they potentially black out. And yeah, it's not a great thing to have, but once we get them on the ground, we have a good idea of where they are. I would recommend a supervisor or CIC going over to a regular computer, tracking the airplane on flightaware.com, and we will have an extremely good sense from that about exactly where the airplane goes down. So between calling 911, tracking them normally, tracking them on something like flightaware.com, even though that's delayed by a minute, getting them down, I think this improves the odds as good as we can. The autopilot version of what I'm calling the intentional rural crash is similar. You could do it with the engine running or with the engine off. I definitely prefer the power off, but we'll talk about the power on for a second. Power on, it might be when you set the autopilot up, you don't necessarily know where you're going to land, and so some people might prefer to leave the power on until they shut it off at the last second. You can do that. I wouldn't make the actual landing with the power on. One thing I've thought about when I've gamed this out, and this could stand to be refined a little bit, in terms of the vertical mode for the autopilot, I would greatly prefer for this situation, if the power is going to be on, setting it up for about a 300 foot per minute descent. And here's why. You might think that a gentler descent is nicer and safer somehow, say setting 100 or 200 foot per minute vertical rate of descent. I don't like that for a couple of reasons. One, the difference between landing at 100 or 200 feet a minute and landing at 300 feet a minute is pretty negligible. 300 feet a minute is basically just a firm landing that all of us pilots make from time to time, some of us more regularly than others, myself excluded, of course. But anyway, 300 foot per minute is basically fine. Number two, autopilots are not designed to land the airplane, and I cannot vouch for every kind of autopilot and every kind of airplane. If you're coming in really gentle at something on the order of 100 or 200 feet a minute, that's fairly gentle, and what can happen is the airplane can, and pilots will understand this, non-pilot rated controllers might not, but when the airplane gets down in ground effect, if you're only doing 100 or 200 feet a minute, you'll get into ground effect and you'll actually be there with enough time for the autopilot to maybe react, and then you think you're going to get a 100 or 200 foot per minute touchdown with the autopilot because it's been doing the 100 or 200 foot per minute descent, but once you get into ground effect, if the autopilot becomes out of phase at all, the touchdown itself can become unstable. Therefore, I like about 300, maybe 400 foot per minute descent because it minimizes the amount of time that the airplane is exposed to ground effect. That might disrupt the autopilot and make for an unstable landing. The second point about having something like a 300 foot per minute descent rate as compared to something more gentle, about 100 or 200 foot per minute descent rate, is this. In my thinking on this is kind of colored by the fact that I live over on the west side of Indianapolis, and so when I fly, I'm often to the west of Indy, and there are a lot of farm fields, but every mile or so there's a bunch of trees, kind of along the property lines. Well, what happens is, if you come in and just set the autopilot up, because the pilot's getting ready to black out, and so they're going to set the autopilot up, in this configuration right before they black out. Well, if you set it up for something like 100 feet per minute, you're coming in super, low angle and so on. But I argue, and I don't have the mathematical proof for this, but I kind of have this intuitive sense that when you're coming in so gentle, so flat, you're actually increasing the odds that you're going to hit trees that are, again, popping up every mile or so or half mile along these farm fields, and you're going to hit trees while you're still airborne, and that's really bad. By setting it up for a slightly steeper rate of descent of about 300 feet per minute, I obviously can't guarantee that you're not going to hit trees first, but I think you come in just a little bit steeper, and you're actually set up better for having better statistical chance of landing in a farm field. For what it's worth, flaps probably one notch. I wouldn't necessarily go to full flaps in that case. You can. The typical rule of thumb for a lot of GA airplanes, that's going to slow the landing speed only very marginally and so on. And I would set the power for a speed of, and I haven't really figured this one out, probably some kind of typical speed that you would use for like a base leg or a final approach. But keep in mind, again, this is assuming that the pilot is able to set this up right before they totally black out from a heart attack or whatever. That's a power adjustment, and now you are coming in with more kinetic energy than would be ideal, and so that's one way to do it. I prefer power off, but if you're going to shut the engine off and have the autopilot fly the airplane, what you need to do is not set a foot per minute descent rate, okay, because that can lead to an autopilot-induced stall, and that would be potentially deadly. And so what I would recommend is setting the autopilot into either an indicated airspeed or the flight level change, the filch mode, if one is available on that autopilot. Some autopilots can do that, even for small GA airplanes, others cannot. But if they can, I would set the filch or the speed mode on the autopilot, and that way it's going to pitch to get to that speed. The speed I would set it for is the minimum sink speed for the weight. If you remember, and I didn't think to pull up this graphic, I'm not going to try to do it here while I'm filming this live, but if you think in terms of the glider polar that I introduced in one of those foundational ground school lessons, whatever the best glide speed is, minimum sink speed is going to be about 10 to 15% less, and technically you would adjust it for the weight of the aircraft. Since this is a single pilot GA airplane, it's probably light. Okay, who knows what the fuel weight's going to be. And so very typically you could set this for about 20% underneath the book value for best glide speed at max gross weight. Also, here I would recommend 1 notch of flaps, and that is not going to affect the speed situation. For what it's worth, I would definitely not go more than 1 notch of flaps here in the power off autopilot intentional rural crash, because once you go beyond 1 notch of flaps, okay, what happens is you are certainly adding drag, and because the autopilot in this mode is targeting a speed, the only way to get that speed with the engine off, okay, with extra drag, is to increase the descent rate. Again, in some cases that might actually help you come in steeper, but it's going to be a firmer landing and so on. So there are trade-offs. There's no one way to put it, but my preference, if somebody is getting ready to black out, okay, this would be kind of like that South Dakota situation. They're getting ready to black out. Maybe the verbiage is going to be something like, hey, we practice this, we train for this. Do you trust us with a recommendation? And if the pilot says, well, yeah, at least maybe. I'm getting ready to black out here. Okay, does your autopilot have a speed or a filch mode? Yes. Okay. Autopilot on, just heading hold. Put them on a heading that's preferably into the wind. Okay, but put them, assuming they're still pointed towards a rural area, set the autopilot for a speed that's about 20% less than the best glide speed. That will be your minimum sink speed for the weight. Get your engine shut off, go 1 notch of flaps, get your fuel and electric shut off. Okay, now the engine's off. The autopilot's flying the airplane heading mode into the wind. That's going to reduce the ground speed. They've got the airplane configured. And then, pilot, if you can, call 911 right now. They can use the enhanced location services to help find the airplane. In the meantime, what I'm recommending we would be doing behind the scenes is tracking the airplane on FlightAware, calling 911 ourselves, identifying ourselves, obviously, explaining we've got a pilot who's getting ready to go down. We have a good feel for exactly where they're going down between our description, probably tracking them through FlightAware, and the pilot at least maybe having the cell phone on, even if the pilot is now at the point where he or she is blacking out. I think that improves the odds as well as we can for this difficult and rare situation. Thank you.